Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Goldwater Institute. How's the sound in the back? Can you hear me back there? Can't hear you. Can't hear me. I can hear you guys. All right. This is a great group. Dan is going to turn up the microphone for us, and so you'll be able to hear just a little bit better in a minute. But welcome to the Goldwater Institute. I am Darcy Olson, the president of the Goldwater Institute. Thank you. It is always a pleasure to see so many of our good friends and supporters here. And today is an extra special day because we have, I understand, Tea Party patriots from all around the country. Well, we want you to know. Oh. She wants to know how I got the seams straight on my stockings. I can tell we're going to have a good time here tonight. I'd like you to, I want you all to know how much I truly appreciate and how much we at the Goldwater Institute appreciate your involvement and your activism in the community. I have a question for you. What is the first thing that government tries to do when there is an uprising in a country? That's right. They shut down the media. They shut down all forms of communication, right? Think of Egypt, Libya, Yemen, all over the place. And they do that because information is the most powerful tool in the world if it is shared with others. And that's why the work that you are doing, standing on the front lines, sharing ideas, speaking out, supporting organizations like the Goldwater Institute is so critical. I truly believe that information is that fine line in society between freedom and oppression, and you are standing right there on those front lines, and we are so grateful to you for all you're doing. Give yourselves a round of applause. Absolutely. Now, I'm not going to delay the program. I know you are eager to hear Nick, so I just have just a quick something to say about that. The topic today is one of the most important domestic policy questions that I think that we can ask in our time, which is how can the American people defend our freedoms against Washington's overreach? And Nick Dranias, our constitutional policy director, will talk to you tonight about what we believe is one of the most promising powers that we have at our disposal, which is exercising our rights under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. Now, a few years ago, I may have been like many of you were, or maybe even are today, I sort of assumed that this was a dead letter of the Constitution or had just been highly abused, like the Dormant Commerce Clause or the 10th Amendment. But that is not the case. Article 5 is not a dead letter. It is, in fact, very much alive. And it is arguably a provision that we are vindicating and reanimating just in time. And with that, please welcome Nick Dranias to the podium.
First, let me thank Darcy for the opportunity to have a job like this. And also thank all the supporters of the Goldwater Institute for making it possible as well. Look, I have to just start this by saying thank you to the Tea Party. The Tea Party spirit and the Tea Party movement is probably the thing that has made it possible to have any kind of optimism for the future. So thank you so much for coming. Now tonight we're going to talk about something that unfortunately divides the home team. That people that I respect, people that you respect, people that we know are concerned about. They're concerned about this power that the states have to cause Congress to call a convention for proposing amendments. And I want to just tell you that the purpose of my discussion is really to lead you through the reasoning that led me to where I am today, where I say this is the state's ultimate power in the Constitution to rein in an out-of-control federal government. It is not a self-destruct button. The founders did not put a self-destruct button into the Constitution. They put a fail-safe. They put a big, shiny red button that says press in case of an emergency. We are at the cusp of the precipice, to mix metaphors. But we are at the point where our republic is literally fraying, where the Constitution hangs by one vote in the Supreme Court. If we wait much longer to explore and understand and use this power, we may find ourselves in a gulag. So we have to really seriously question the fear that I felt, and that I'm sure some of you feel about this process. A year ago, I approached this with some trepidation. Why? Because I had been told that this power that states have to convene a convention for proposing amendments was one that could explode the Constitution. And I was told that by people I respected. And I saw long lists of scholars that said the same thing. Many of the scholars I respected. But there was something about it that bothered me. How can we be constitutionalists, cherishing so much about the Constitution, and then hit this road bump and look at Article 5 like it's some disaster waiting there to lure us into destroying our Constitution? It didn't make sense. There had to be a deeper purpose to it. And what sparked me to begin my own investigation was what happened when TARP was passed. You had well over 70% of the American people. It didn't matter what party you were from. It didn't matter what part of the country you were from. Everybody rose up and said no. Not once, but twice. And what happened? To no political gain. There was nothing to gain from this politically. Washington ignored the voices of the people, gave the power to engage in a $700 billion slush fund to an unelected bureaucrat in the executive branch. And it became apparent to me that there was something fundamentally wrong with Washington. It wasn't that the political process was not working. It was deeper than that. It was that there was a bubble, essentially, around the folks who went to Washington, to whom it didn't even matter that their political lives were in jeopardy for that vote. And it struck me that the reason for this was there was no counterbalance of power. There was nothing but Washington, D.C. in our nation at that time. It's the only game in town. But it didn't have to always be that way. It wasn't always that way. Some of you are aware that there was a thing called the 17th Amendment that took the states out of the U.S. Senate and eliminated the counterbalance of the states once provided in Washington, D.C. And so I started looking for an alternative. We don't have that power anymore, but where can we find the counterbalance that no longer exists? I believe that's what Article 5 is. Now, just before we get into this, Article 5 is the power that 2/3 of state legislatures have to apply to Congress, for Congress to call a convention for proposing amendments. The people who would attend that convention would be representatives of the states. How do we know that? Because this is a process that the founders established to be parallel to and separate from the congressional constitutional amendment process. The convention would be convened by Congress, but it would be populated by the state representatives, known as delegates. Whatever it proposed as amendments, if it proposed any, would have to then be sent out for ratification to the states. It would take 3/4 of the states, 38 states, either through the legislatures or through state-based ratification conventions, to turn those proposals into constitutional law. So the thing to understand about this process is that there are many checks built into it. 2/3 of state legislatures have to apply for it. Congress has to call it. The convention has to be populated with state representatives. Something actually has to get proposed. Congress has to refer it out for ratification. It has to jump through 38 states to become constitutional law. That is a complicated process. And that was the first thing that set off a light bulb in my mind. This can't be all that easy to run away. This is something that is very carefully constructed to have plenty of checks and balances. So let's now just jump forward and talk about what you could do with this power. Assume the best for the moment. Just assume the best. We'll get to the worst, I promise you. Q&A, I encourage you to ask me any question that troubles you, anything that you don't think I addressed adequately. Bring to my attention during Q&A. I'll try to anticipate it and persuade you that there's nothing to fear in the course of this. But let's just think about the positive for a moment. Let's think about what would happen if we could amend the Constitution. Well, one of the best ideas, probably the most powerful idea that is out there right now, is something called the National Debt Relief Amendment. It's a very simple idea. It says any increase in the federal debt requires the approval of a majority of the legislatures of the separate states. Why is this so powerful? Why is this so different from any other amendment idea? In my mind, it's one fundamental fact. It's self-enforcing. We cannot rely on the courts to enforce a balanced budget amendment. They don't enforce much of what else is in the Constitution. But what would happen if the federal government tried to issue bonds for sale on the financial markets without state approval as required by the Constitution? Would the financial markets go, oh, say, sure, let's buy those? If they did, they would charge a much higher interest rate. But wouldn't that also be a sign, like waving a red flag? We are a bankrupt national government. We won't even follow our Constitution. And the chances are that the financial markets would not even buy those bonds. So the brilliance of this very simple idea is it can be enforced independently of the courts. It can be enforced entirely through private financial markets, through either incentivizing compliance through raising the interest rates or just not buying the bonds. That reality, that realism is what immediately hit me is how powerful this was. The next thing that hit me was even if the states gave approval, think of the dynamic that would change in our federal budgeting. No matter how you slice it, it'd be pretty hard to get 26 states to agree to anything, right? What are the chances that a federal government that needs to run 50% on debt, which it nearly does right now, what are the chances that they would wait to the midnight hour to go out to 26 states and try to get their approval? What this would incentivize is something that we expect from businesses. Heck, we even expect it from school districts. It would incentivize the federal government to have a budget crafted early. Give it enough time if it needs debt to go out to the 50 states and make their case. And they would have to make their case not to insiders, but to outsiders, which means they'd have to have a very clear case if they wanted debt to get it. Now, I'm not saying that debt wouldn't be approved. It's possible 26 states would approve debt. But just think of the transparency and the additional accountability, this simple process of forcing a budget to be crafted early and presented in 50 states for debate and consideration in terms clear enough to persuade at least what it'd have to be around 1,800 state legislators to vote yes on it. So the dynamic of federal budgeting would change dramatically. There's no other idea out there that would do this. You can have a balanced budget amendment, and there's nothing wrong with that, but there's nothing that would prevent the midnight hour. Oh my God, we have to go for the emergency exception. So every angle that I looked at on this idea, from a policy perspective, confirmed how powerful it was as a structural element. And then the last thing that sealed the deal, remember I talked about the 17th Amendment? About how the states used to have a voice in federal government? How the states had control of the Senate? This would give the states a large measure of the very same power without taking away anyone's right to vote for a senator. And not only would it give the states the power to influence the federal government, it would do so in direct proportion to the federal government's irresponsibility. Because what leverage would the states have except when the federal government's running an insane amount of debt? And so to the very extent that the federal government behaved irresponsibly, the state's power would increase. To the very extent the federal government behaved responsibly, the state's power would decrease. So you would have literally probably the best structural counterweight to federal irresponsibility that I've ever read in any constitution. And I've studied all of them in 50 states, and I've studied the US Constitution for almost a decade now, intensively. This is a heck of a reward. And so the questions that I approach, and I ask you to approach the next portion of this presentation is, to get any reward, is it ever risk-free? Did the founders, when the first shots were fired in 1776, do you think that they thought that for sure we're going to have George Washington and my God, he won't be king and we'll have all these liberties and everything will be just hunky-dory? Or did they realize that the status quo was already pointing to oblivion for their freedoms and they had nothing to lose and everything to gain? Right now, our debt is shooting past $14 trillion. That's only what's on the books. If you count what's off the books, the so-called spending commitments, it's shooting past $110 trillion. If you break that down based on taxpayers, you're talking about people owing $150,000 each, roughly. We're talking about future generations whose lives are burdened with a mortgage that will increasingly be impossible for them to meet. And I don't know how you guys feel about WikiLeaks, but something just literally flipped my lid just about a week ago. Our creditors aren't giving us this money for nothing, and they're not giving it to us for a 1% return on treasury bonds. What we saw in WikiLeaks reported a couple of weeks ago, and you can still find it, is that China does not hesitate to use the leverage that its status as the primary financer of our debt gives it. It has directed Ben Bernanke and the Fed where to send money to bail out their investments. That's just the beginning, my friends. You're worried about sovereignty being lost to Washington, D.C.? Well, try Beijing. So we don't have a whole lot of time, we don't have a whole lot of options, but we certainly have a heck of a reward if we just have the courage. So let me ask you this. Here's the first point of analysis and self-reflection as you consider the risks versus the rewards. Who do you trust more? Honestly, who trusts Congress more than the states? Anybody? Good point. That's why I said more. The last time I asked this question, I asked, who do you trust? And everybody said, nobody. And that's right. But the choices are what they are. And in our Constitution, there are two potential sources of constitutional amendments: Congress or state legislatures. Who do you trust more? Let me put it to you this way. Of these two bodies, who is more likely to restrict the power of Congress? Again, let me just hammer back on what Article 5 says relative to the state's powers, just to have you see the checks and balances built into the process. 2/3 of the several states shall apply, Congress shall call, not a constitutional convention, by the way. Do you see the word constitutional convention? Anybody? The word does not appear. We'll get to why later. A convention for proposing amendments. When it becomes part of the Constitution is when 3/4 of the state ratify it. 3/4. Now I want you to think about 3/4 means. It means 38 states, and that's a high enough hurdle, but think of it this way. All it takes is 13 states to block whatever comes out of it. I can count the 13 states that would block Obamacare. Last time I checked, there were 27 states that were on the lawsuit. 28 now, all right. So our bulwark, our ultimate bulwark on whatever you can imagine happening under Article 5 is 13 states. Now let me tell you something. Can I promise you 10, 15, 20 years from now, those 13 states will still be the bulwark they are today? Right. Now or never, my friends. So, let's talk about the mythology. Now I am going to tease you a little bit. Forgive me. But at some point in my thinking of this, I realized that a cold bucket of water was needed to really shake me out of the fear, because ultimately, the risks we are taking by doing nothing, by relying on Washington to behave itself, are so obviously more dangerous than taking this shot that I just had to just smack myself. So this is a nice little tap. Let me first emphasize, this is not a radical idea. How is it not a radical idea? All of the founders advocated the use of Article 5. Most importantly, Article 5, the power of states, in parallel to Congress, to propose amendments through an amendments convention, was the major sales point for ratifying the Constitution. How do I know that? All you have to do is read for yourself the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were the 85 pamphlets written by the founders, John Jay, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, maybe a few others that we haven't discovered yet. Bottom line is, these 85 pamphlets were the sales pitch to the states, who were very skeptical as to why they should ratify the Constitution. The arguments contained in these pamphlets are the reasons why we have a Constitution. They had to convince the states to step away from the Articles of Confederation and to buy into the Constitution. And what were the arguments that they used? The most powerful argument used to get the consent and ratification of the states to the Constitution was the existence of the power given by Article 5. How do I know that? It's not just that James Madison made this point in Federalist 43, that the Constitution equally enables the general and the state governments to originate the amendment of errors. That's not just the basis of what I'm saying. The reason why I say this is the most important sales point for the ratification of the Constitution, without which the ratification of the Constitution would never have happened, is because it is the final argument in Alexander Hamilton's Federalist number 85. Let me just ask you, don't hold this against me. I'm an attorney. How many attorneys are in the audience? All right. Clint. All right, never mind. Look, one of the most important things an attorney can do is do a great closing argument. You botched the closing argument, you botched the case. It's done. You're toast. Federalist 85 is the closing argument to the states as to why they should ratify the Constitution. It is the last pamphlet. It is the summation of every argument. It is what would seal the deal or not at all. And guess what the last 5 paragraphs of Federalist 85 are all about? Oh, again? Well, I'll read it. The last 5 paragraphs of Federalist 85 were the following issue. Let's not have another general constitutional convention. Those things are crazy. They run out of control when you open everything up to a constitutional convention. Instead, go with what we've crafted as a constitution. It's good enough. If there's any problems with it, we've given you, the states, the same power as Congress to amend it. And, quote, we may safely rely on the disposition of the state legislatures to erect barriers against the encroachments of the national authority, end quote. Don't take my word for it. Hop on Google, look for Federalist 85. The closing argument for the ratification of the convention was, if you think we got the balance of power wrong, fear not. You don't have to have another general, wide-open constitutional convention. The states have their own parallel power to amend the Constitution independently of Congress, and we can trust them to keep Congress in line. Sale closed. Nobody who considers themselves a constitutionalist and reads the Federalist Papers, and reads in particular Federalist 85, cannot be shaken if they believe that this is a power the states were not supposed to use. Not only was it a power the states were supposed to use, but we wouldn't have a constitution if it hadn't been in the Constitution. But didn't the Constitutional Convention run away? I mean, don't we have a history of, no matter, if you just use the word convention, doesn't it just mean everything is going to go to heck? I mean, we're just going to run away and everything's going to turn into something wild and crazy. here's where we did additional research. Turns out there's nothing inherently wild and crazy about a convention. The word didn't have the same significance it has to us today at the time. Conventions were simply gatherings of people. They happened at the state level, they happened at the interstate level, they happened all the time. There's nothing about the word convention, and I'll get into the definitions of the time shortly, but there's nothing about the word convention that inherently means we're gonna have a wide open, let's start a government from scratch convention. And it is a myth that even our Constitutional Convention of 1787 was a completely runaway convention. It did not run away. It did exactly what its agenda was. What was its agenda? I've highlighted the call of Congress for the Constitutional Convention. You can find this on Google. You can look at this yourself. We actually have an Article 5 page at www.goldwaterinstitute.org. The purpose of this Constitutional Convention of 1787, as stated in the congressional call, which at the time was reflecting the will of states because Congress at the time was composed entirely of states as states, at least through their delegates. And this language, by the way, is reflected in all of the commissions, the instructions given to state delegates who actually arrived there, except for New Jersey. Don't know why. But the purpose was to establish in these states a firm national government. Now, does anyone here have to be a constitutional scholar to make a case that the Constitution is establishing a firm national government? No, but you're saying surely there were limitations on this, because we always hear that the Constitutional Convention ran away and it did things it wasn't supposed to do and nobody knew what it was going to do. Well, first of all, check your history on that. There were actually only 3 delegates out of several dozen that even complained that the Constitutional Convention ran away. Now, I'm sure there's 3 people in here that will have an opinion about what I said that had nothing to do with what I said, right? So that is not enough evidence. But let's say you're saying, but there had to be a limit. There had to be a limit. Why would all these people say this now? Well, the reality is there really wasn't a limit. What it said is the purpose was to revise the Articles of Confederation. The term revise at the time meant total rewrite. It meant to completely recodify. It didn't just talk about amendments or even alterations. It talked about provisions being added. Did the Constitution not add provisions? Certainly it did. And then lastly, the only principle that they had to guide this process of revision and new provisions was the statement, let's render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union, period. Could there be a wider agenda than that? Is it any wonder that the convention generated a foundational document defining the Constitution? It did exactly what it was called to do. It followed its agenda to the letter. That is not a runaway convention. It's a very wide and general and open convention, but it doesn't show you that the founders went hog wild and did whatever they wanted. They didn't. That is a myth. Similarly, we in our research have discovered that there have been numerous interstate conventions in the history of our country. In fact, the Congress itself, prior to the establishment of the Constitution, was an interstate convention. It wasn't even really a legislative body per se, so much as just a bunch of state delegates meeting. There were at least 12 of them that we've been able to identify so far. All 12 of these interstate conventions had agendas. None of them went off and ran away and did something different than what their agenda was. What was their agenda? Well, one state was charging tariffs on another state's goods and they wanted to talk about that. Another one was talking about taxes. Another one was saying their merchants were being unfairly treated. Others said somebody's not paying their war debt. I mean, these agendas defined what happened at these conventions. Nothing in history at an interstate convention has ever strayed from the agenda. But you're still saying, we have to be worried. I mean, just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it won't happen, right? If I've seen 1,000 white swans, it doesn't preclude there being a black swan. And that's a perfectly legitimate point. But you don't even have to dig very deep. You don't even have to go any further than the language of Article 5 itself to see that the Article 5 power given to the states to propose amendments is not a foundational, strike all, start over from scratch power to amend the Constitution. How do you know that? Well, we'll get to the top part later, but I just wanted you to, if you have your pocket constitution, by the way, look at the last sentence, the last clause of the last sentence of Article 5. It says, no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. This is a profound limitation on the power to amend the Constitution in Article 5, and here's why. This establishes that nobody could propose a strike-all amendment to completely replace the Constitution without the consent of all of the states, all 50. This one statement establishes that the normal amendment process, the 2/3, 3/4 process, cannot justify a complete rewrite and total trashing of the Constitution, period. There is no strike-all. This is not an accident. If you tried to run through a strike-all of the Constitution and you struck everything else out of the Constitution except for the states and the Senate and their suffrage in the Senate, guess what you're left with? You're left with a structure that is exactly like the Articles of Confederation. Think of the symmetry of this. I mean, is that not profound? That if any state tried to maximize their power to strike out the Constitution, the only thing that could result under the terms of Article 5 is a return to what they started with. Now, if the text doesn't convince you that this is not a wide open power to amend and trash the Constitution, I urge you to get on to Google and look for the Elliott debates that show during the Constitutional Convention there was an effort to replace the current language of Article 5, which has the ratification processes, with specific authority to have a general convention. It was proposed not once and shot down, not twice and shot down, not 3 times and shot down, but 4 times within the span of 3 pages. Each time it was shot down. And here is what I found most significant from this evidence. The last 2 times it was shot down unanimously twice. Now, how many in this room are legislators or familiar with legislation? What is the significance of unanimously refusing an amendment twice?
It's dead.
It's dead. It's dead. The founders sent so many different clear messages that the power in Article 5 is a restrained power. It has limitations. It is not a wide open convention. You can't get any clearer than the historical record. All a convention is, and all it was ever meant to be at the time of the founding, is a task force, what we would call today a task force. How do we know this? Well, you can look at the practices that we've already talked about of the 12 conventions that have happened. They had agendas, they sent delegates, they stayed within the agenda. They either did something or didn't do something. But you could look at the original definitions of convention, and these are just a sample. You could look at all the dictionaries you want to at the time. All a convention is an assembly of people to do a certain thing or another. That's all it was. It didn't have some sort of mystical significance that you use the word convention and now we're just going to have to create a new constitution because that's what conventions do. It didn't mean that. It simply meant an organization or an assembly of people to tackle a given task. Now you're probably asking, okay, that's all great, but who sets the agenda? Right? I mean, how do we know that okay, we'll grant you you can't get rid of the entire Constitution, you could strike out everything but the states and the Senate but who sets that? Can Congress do that to us? Could they get rid of everything except the states and the Senate if they wanted to? Well, I don't know. Would you guys object to that? Look, the fact is we know that this was meant to be a targeted process, and a targeted process the states controlled. We know this from James Madison's writings. Now, how many here are familiar with nullification? Now, you're probably familiar with the Virginia resolutions, which was Madison's first articulation of what nullification was, and Madison basically said it was a really important type of protest. In his description of what was going on in the Virginia resolution, in his report to the delegates, he specifically said, if this protest doesn't work, the states have the power to achieve the same object, which is to get rid of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were threatening people like Thomas Jefferson with jail time for opposing John Adams. He said that states could always resort to the same object by using their Article 5 powers. Again, you can look this up in Google. Now, that tells you that it was understood within 10 years of the ratification of the Constitution that an amendments convention from the states can have a specific target aimed at even the repeal of specific legislation. 30 years later, he made the same point again when the next nullification debate started. And he said, folks, you're wasting your time with these protests. The real power that the states have is found in Article 5. You can use that power and target it to, quote, secure the government and the rights of the states. That was close to his deathbed. So James Madison really meant it. We know that his understanding was that it could be targeted. Does that mean it would always be targeted? No, it's up to the states. The states define the process. Our research shows that there's a belt and suspenders for the states to define the process. When 2/3 of them apply, they specify the agenda. When they send their representatives, called delegates, they specify the agenda. Both ways, you're locking down the delegates as representatives of the states to stay in that agenda. Just like if the governor were to call a special session of the legislature, and the legislature meets, the legislature, they don't send your neighbors or your precinct captains, right? The legislature meets. They're there as agents of the people in their particular capacity. Delegates to the convention are there to represent the states. We know from Federalist 85, again, the closing argument of the Federalist Papers, that Congress's role is not to do anything except to respond like a secretary when it gets these 34 applications and establish a place and time for the convention. It is a ministerial task. Preemptory was the word used by Alexander Hamilton, which means there is no room for discretion. Congress doesn't have a role to decide who attends the convention, and it doesn't make any sense. The whole point of this power being given to the states, as you saw from the Federalist Papers, was to give the states a different power parallel to that of Congress. It would make no sense to interpret this power to be basically giving back to Congress the same power they already have. So the power of Congress is not in any way significant. It is simply to act as the state's secretary in calling the convention. We know that the states will vote at states at the convention because that's how it was done in all 12 interstate conventions. You're not convinced by that? Well, look, how do you know that tomorrow minority vote won't rule in Congress? It's not written anywhere in the Constitution. Why do we have a filibuster in the Senate? That's not written anywhere in the Constitution. Custom and practice matter when it comes to how legislative bodies operate. The only custom and practice that has ever existed for any interstate convention of any kind, and there have been 12, has been states voting as states. There is no reason to believe that anything else would happen. And then let's just say you wanted to believe that something else would happen. You still got to get through 38 states. Or to put it another way, you got to get past 13 objecting. So this is an incredibly state-driven, state-controlled process. And here's the bottom line. The founders meant it to be used. It is not foundational. It can be targeted. It's state-controlled. It's state-ratified. Folks, this is the counterweight. Now, of course, I can't give you a detailed listing of what the rules of the convention would be. So you might ask, could it become a circus? Well, or something worse. Well, let's just run with that, because this is really a thought process that helped me deal with that fear. What is the worst that a runaway convention could do? Just imagine somehow the stars aligned and the worst possible thing was done and somehow enacted into constitutional law. Well, maybe they'd establish a body of unelected officials who are immune from meaningful judicial, administrative, and congressional review that have the power to run the country unilaterally. We're almost there. Some would say we are there. TARP, we talked about TARP, $700 billion slush fund given to an unelected bureaucrat in the executive branch. IPAB, that is the bureaucratic entity called the death panel by Sarah Palin. The reality is it's kind of worse than a death panel because it's actually been given unbridled power to hit a cost reduction schedule, literally. Whatever it takes to reduce the cost of Medicare, you go do it, is their mandate, and there is nothing to allow the Congress to repeal them except for a short window of time for, what, 1 week, Clint? 1 week in 2017 in January? 2 weeks, 2 weeks. It actually says that Congress cannot repeal IPAB except for a 2-week window in 2017. And then the last thing is, look, folks, I love the Second Amendment, okay? I think it's great. I think what the Supreme Court did in Citizens United and not permitting outright censorship of a documentary that was in proximity of an election, I think that's great. But folks, nothing yet has come of the Second Amendment. Not yet. We've gotten great rulings. Those laws are still pretty much in place where they were. And both of those rulings, both on preventing censorship of a documentary and on affirming that the Second Amendment means what it says, both of those rulings were 5-4 decisions. That's right. Well, I don't think it would change that, but the bottom line is we're one bus accident away from losing the very decisions that everyone says don't touch the Constitution about. And we cannot seriously, as people who are weighing risks and rewards, put all of our eggs in this basket. The status quo is not acceptable. Okay, but you're still saying, I'm not convinced. All right? Well, I'm gonna give you, let's imagine the worst possible thing that could happen. Imagine that Karl Marx came back from the dead and he had the money of a George Soros or a David Koch. You take your picture, your pick. So Karl Marx comes back from the dead, and his goal is to conquer the United States and to change it and subvert its constitution. And he's got plan A or plan B. So plan A would involve all the usual things of the status quo. Why he could influence one president and maybe one of the administrative czars and get the EPA to take away everyone's property rights. Or you could have an executive order issue like, I hate to say it, President Lincoln, to throw people in jail without habeas corpus. Or, he could influence one Supreme Court judge and flip them on gun rights. Or, he could have a treaty passed. Depending on the quorum, it would only take influencing 33 to 67 senators and one president. Or he could do regular laws, again, depending on the quorum, 26 to 60 senators, 110 to 218 congressmen. Or he could just use the traditional method for 27 amendments to our Constitution. He could try to go through Congress, again, depending on the quorum. All he'd have to do is influence 33 to 67 senators, 144 to 292 congressmen, and then run it through 38 states. So the status quo option is any of the following to conquer the world and to subvert our Constitution. And people are worried that instead he might consider Plan B, which is Article 5. Now let's look at what Article 5 would entail for poor little Karl. First, Karl would have to influence there are about 7,500, 8,000 state legislators. So first he'd have to convince to get the applications into Congress some 2,500 state legislators in 34 states to send in the application to create a socialist utopia. Then he'd have to get Congress to not hold the bill, but to actually send it out for a convention. And that would require controlling 26 to 60 senators and 110 to 218 congressmen, depending on the quorum. Then, once the convention was set up, he'd have to then get the states, a majority of them, to send delegates there that he could control. That would require controlling at least 1,900 state legislators in 26 states. Then the convention would be called, assuming each state only gets one delegate, he'd have to control at least 26 delegates. Then, when the convention proposed his socialism utopia amendment, he'd have to again control the Congress to make sure it was sent out for ratification how he liked. Then, when it went out to the states for ratification, he'd have to control some 2,750 state legislators, or tens of thousands, maybe millions of delegates if they chose to go the ratification convention route. And all the while, he'd have to make sure he had one Supreme Court justice in his pocket in case anyone mounted a legal challenge. Now, I mean this in a straight way. If you were Karl, how would you try to subvert the Constitution? If you don't buy it yet, let's try an illustration. Here's the status quo. Here's the Article 5 convention. And for folks who can't see this, it's a choice between just blowing up the Constitution or using a Rube Goldberg machine to do the same thing. Okay, you still think that Karl's going to go for it, right? All right. who has the advantage? If Karl chooses the status quo, and it's you versus Karl, who wins? If Karl chooses Article 5, and it's you versus Karl, who wins? Now, the bottom line is, no matter how you slice it, Article 5 is less of a threat than the status quo. If you're still not convinced, look, I'm almost 40 years old. I was a weird kid. I used to belong to a thing called the United Students for America in high school. My yearbook picture says the right wing is the right wing. There was something wrong with me, right? I was very conscious of Reagan. I remember the moment when he bombed Gaddafi, and seeing how things are going today, I wish he didn't miss. But look, let's face reality here. The Reagan Revolution, we had, first of all, does anyone here know, well, it's not fair, but maybe there is another Reagan out there, but what happened at the end of Reagan? Everything fell apart. Be honest. Then we had the contract with America, and everything was going to work out again, and what happened after that? It's dead. But then we put the Republicans in charge of the entire federal government, top to bottom. Surely things are going to change now. Well, first we got McCain-Feingold, which censored documentaries because they were too close to an election. Then we got the prescription drug benefit that massively increased entitlements. Then we got trillions more in debt, at least until now, far beyond anything other than in wartime. And then we got TARP. Now, that's the status quo. And I'm sure you're all hearing this too. It really will be different this time. We got it now. And I have to hand it to you, the Tea Party is making it a little more plausible in a way that it hasn't been. However, folks, if you remember the Reagan era, if you remember the Gingrich era, these were powerful forces. These were very charged, intellectual, ideological times where the possibilities seemed equally endless as I remember it. They did seem equally endless. We cannot rely on promises. It's time for leverage. And Article 5 is what gives us that leverage. So I want to thank you for coming. That's the presentation.